Tonight we're going to continue in the book of Ruth. We're going to be in chapter 2. And remember, I want you to remember why we're here. Savannah probably walked in after 5 months and said, the book of Esther, not Ruth, Esther. I keep saying Ruth, I think, in the book of Esther. Why are we in the book of Esther? Because this is one of Satan's most successful plots in the Bible. He's tried for thousands of years to stop the seed of the woman promised from coming to earth. He doesn't want the seed to be born, the seed that will one day crush him on the head. So when God made him that promise in the garden, he has tried ever since to stop it from happening. And so we're seeing in the book of Esther how close God allowed Satan to get. This to me is probably one of, if not the greatest successful plot of Satan to destroy all of Israel. And remember, Jesus is Israel. Jesus is a Jew. So if Satan could get Israel destroyed off the planet in the book of Esther, then everything is off. No Savior, no sin bearer. The promise of God to send a deliverer is over, and Satan wins. And it's interesting to me that although Satan has no power of his own, that he can't do anything that God doesn't allow him to do, it's interesting to me just how close God lets Satan get. It's like he baits him. And Satan got very, very close. Very, very close tonight. Issues with the book of Esther one more time, just so you have them in your notes, at least in your thoughts. There are people that say the book of Esther doesn't belong in the Holy Scriptures because of these issues. There's no mention of God in the book by His name, Yahweh, the Lord. There's no Ale. Even the word Ale for God is not in the book of Esther anywhere. So there's no mention of God. There's no mention of God by name, Yahweh. He's not in this book, although He very much is. He's just not named. The New Testament never quotes the book of Esther. Certainly, if it was a valuable, this is what some critics say, if it was a valuable book, certainly the New Testament would quote it, but it never does. The Mosaic Law in the book of Esther is not mentioned. Not one time do we have mention of Passover or any of the feast days, the morning sacrifices. Of course, they're out of the land, but even still, there's no mention of the Mosaic Law. As a matter of fact, in the book of Esther, the Mosaic Law is trampled on by Esther. Sacrificings and offerings to God are that should be not. Sacrificings and offerings to God not referred to. Again, the Mosaic Law and its sacrifices and offerings. In the book of Esther, they're in Persia, they're out of the land. There's no mention of it at all. Prayer to God is not mentioned or practiced. Esther and Mordecai, we get a great Christian bumper sticker quote from the book of Esther, for such a time as this. Maybe we were raised up for such a time as this. For such a time as this, that idea, that great Christian idea or biblical thought, for such a time as this, comes from the book of Esther. And you would think when Esther's up against the gun that she or her cousin Mordecai would turn to God for guidance. They never do. There is no prayer to God in this book. And that's why some people have a hard time accepting the book of Esther as biblical, that it belongs in the canon of Scripture. I would fight to the death and say, yes, it absolutely does. The Jews, another problem with the book of Esther, the Jews should all have left Persia and gone back to Israel, the promised land, their homeland, but many did not. And as we said last time, it's obvious in this story that Esther, and probably a better word for Mordecai's cousin, Esther and cousin Mordecai are among those Jews who stayed in Persia. They were out of the land. They should have gone back. They're Jews, and they should have desired to live in the Jewish homeland. But they didn't. They stayed in Persia. Why did they do that? That is disobedience. God allowed them back in after the 70 years was over. They didn't go. They chose not to go. That's disobedient to the Lord who allowed them and wanted them to get back. In Esther chapter 1, we covered it last time. I showed you and told you that it was background information and it answered the question or started building up the question, how in the world is it that a Jewish girl becomes queen of Persia? How is it that a Jew becomes a queen anywhere else in the world? And so Esther chapter 1 gives very much background information. And then we started in chapter 2, and here we go. It says in chapter 2, verse 1, after these things. Remember in chapter 1, the idea was that King Ahasuerus, the king has a wife named Vashti. Remember, he has a 180-day banquet where he meets with his generals. He wants to talk about this war with Greece that they're going to have. After the 180-day banquet, he throws another 7-day banquet. And during that banquet, at the end of the banquet, when he's tanked, it says when he's merry with wine, he calls for his wife Vashti, and he commands and demands that she come and present herself as his trophy wife, I guess, if nothing else. Why did he do it? He just wanted to show off her beauty. The Bible says that she was a beautiful woman, but she refused to come. And his counselors told him what you should do so that all wives don't turn against their husbands. You need to make a law and get rid of Vashti. You need to show this the strength that one time she disobeyed you and you got rid of her. And then every woman in the kingdom, every woman in all our provinces will honor their husbands. That was the idea. So that's what happened in chapter 1. We no longer have a Persian queen. It's just the king, Ahasuerus, with no queen. And so chapter 2, verse 1 says, after these things. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. So just very quickly, look at the timeline again. In 486 BC, this is when this man Ahasuerus becomes the king of Persia. And I added 2 things in the middle because these 2 things happen between chapter 1 and between chapter 2. This happens in that little gap. These are the things that happen when it says after these things. There's the banquet at Susa where Queen Vashti disobeys the king. There's after, in 480 BC, there's also the Battle of Salamis, in which Ahasuerus and the Persians are defeated by Greece. Now I added that not because I'm a history buff. I added that to show you that in between chapter 1 and chapter 2, the king has gone to war against Greece. And it's an unsuccessful war. And he comes back licking his wounds, and he's in the palace and he's looking around and he's wondering, why don't I have a queen? What happened to Vashti? He's remembering and recalling him getting drunk, him calling for Vashti, and what his advisors said, get rid of her, make a law and get rid of her. And so in his sentimental recallings of all these things as an unsuccessful war king and thinking about all these things, that's what chapter 2 verse 1 is about. The king's attendants come in, and they come in very quickly. The same people that told him 3 or 4 years ago, get rid of Vashti, are the ones that are understanding the king is missing Vashti and understanding, listen, if he happens to bring Vashti back into the palace, she's not going to be happy with us because we're the ones that told him to get rid of her. So they immediately spring into action. And in verse 2 it says, then the king's attendants who served him, and remember we're answering the question, how does a Jewish girl get to be queen in Persia? Chapter 2 tells that story. The king's attendants who served him, they said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So all of a sudden it labels Esther there as a beautiful young virgin. In verse 3, let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of the kingdom. So this is kingdom-wide. Not just the Persians, but all the beautiful virgins in the kingdom. Let the king appoint overseers in the provinces in all of the kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel in Susa. I showed you this picture last time. This citadel in Susa was a well-built palace. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So he says, even against their will, but what young virgin wouldn't say yes if you came and said, listen, you have an opportunity to be the queen of Persia. If you have any interest in being the queen of Persia, please follow me. Most little girls are going to say, oh yeah, I'll go. Queen of Persia, that's a pretty good deal. So they were to gather them to this citadel, this place, and they were to put them in the harem of the king, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. So I'll tell you right now that this gathering of the virgins is for one reason: to decide who will be queen. And how is King Ahasuerus, according to what these people are planning, how is he going to decide who's going to be his queen? By having sex with them one night. That's what occurs. I'm telling you, the Mosaic law is trampled on in the Book of Esther. But that's exactly what's going on. Continue reading and this will be shown. This let their cosmetics be given to them, by the way, is a 1 year long process, as we'll see in a minute. These virgins are gathered and they're in the palace for 1 year beautifying before they start taking their turns one night with the king. In verse 4 it says, then let the young lady who pleases the king. I don't have to say anything else. Let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So, not to be crude, but it is good to be king, yes? I mean, look at what the king has to look forward to. Every beautiful young virgin in all the houses in his kingdom are going to be brought to him so he can enjoy one night with all of these young virgins. An amazing thing happens here in Persia. Verse 5 says, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew. So now Israel is introduced for the first time. A Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So it follows Mordecai's lineage back to Benjamite. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. It just shows us that he is a Jew. He's not called a Jew. He is a Hebrew Jew by lineage. He's of the tribe of Benjamin, and he's still in Persia when most of the Jews, or when all of the Jews should have gone back, but most of them stayed. He's one of them that stayed. So it says here in verse 6, and I have a problem with this. I believe verse 6 is speaking of Kish. And this is why it says, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. The fact of the matter is, if that description, the person who was taken into exile from Jerusalem, if that's talking about Mordecai, then it makes him about 115 years old. And it would make Esther, his cousin, very, very old. If it's talking about Kish, then the story makes perfect sense. So I believe that it's talking about that very last name that's mentioned, the son of Kish, and he's the one who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem. A couple of facts here. Mordecai, you hear this name Mordecai, it's a Persian name. It's not a Jewish name. Mordecai is a Persian name. Have you ever heard me talk about the king Marduk? When I mention kings Dagon and Baal and Asherah, and sometimes I get around to Marduk. Mordecai, Marduk. Can you hear the difference? Can you hear the similarity? Marduk. His name is derived from the name of a Babylonian god named Marduk. Many of the Jews that were taken into exile were given new names, non-Jewish names. Does that make you think of anybody? that was taken from Israel, a Jew taken from Israel, taken out of Israel into Babylon and given a new name? There it is right there. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 7, then the commander of the officials, the Babylonians, assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So they changed their names, which is very interesting. To me, you know what that's like? It's like tearing down statues. They try to erase their identity. They're trying to take their Jewish heritage from them. Forget everything you are. Forget what you stand for. Forget your history. Forget your God. Because Daniel means my God is my judge. Forget all about that. Your name is going to be called Belteshazzar now, which has a different meaning that I can't recall at the moment. But they stripped them of their Jewish heritage. And this man Mordecai is not his name. It's a name that was given to him, not only a name that's not Hebrew, but a name that's taken after a Babylonian god. I mean, what self-respecting Jew wants to go around carrying the name of a false god? And that's exactly what they've done to Mordecai. Interesting, though, Mordecai hid the fact that he was a Jew. And he also instructed Esther to do the same thing. They were not to let anybody in Persia know that they were Jews. 70 years have gone by. He's got a Persian name, Mordecai, after a Babylonian false god. Esther has been given a new name, as we see. Her name is Hadassah or Hadassah. She's given a new name, Esther. So Mordecai hides the fact that he's Jewish. And he has instructed, as we'll see before this story ends, to tell, or for Esther to also hide the fact that they were Jewish. Now, there's a problem with that. I tell you, the Mosaic Law is trampled on in the Book of Esther, because in the Mosaic Law, it instructs Jews to be distinct from every other culture. You're to eat differently. You're to dress differently. You're to worship differently. Everything about the life of a Jew was to show that they were distinct from everybody else. The law makes it clear, listen to these statements. The law makes it clear that Esther is to only marry a Jew. She's about to become a Persian's wife. The law teaches against premarital sex. And she's about to spend a night with the king. The law teaches against eating certain food, which we'll see clearly in a minute that she breaks. Again, God uses Esther. This isn't a great story of a great heroine of Israel, a real obedient woman, a follower of God. That's not who Esther is. But in spite of all her failures, in spite of who she is, God uses this disobedient Jew to save all of Israel. In verse 7, not only is there Mordecai, the Jew of the Benjamite tribe, in verse 7 it says he was bringing up Hadassah, or Hadassah, and that is Esther. So she has a Hebrew name and it gives it to us. Her name is Hadassah or Hadassah. And she is Mordecai's uncle's daughter. That would make them cousins. She's Mordecai's uncle's daughter. That would make Mordecai and Esther cousins. And he's been bringing her up, it says, for she had no father or mother. I wonder if they were killed when Nebuchadnezzar came through the land in warfare. So Esther, a fact about this name Esther, they take this name Hadassah away from her. Hadassah is a beautiful Hebrew name. It means myrtle. And we're talking about the myrtle tree. The myrtle tree. This is a myrtle tree, and that's what her name means. It's a very fragrant and beautiful tree. It has very beautiful foliage, very beautiful flowers that come out of it. And this is what her mom and dad named her. They named her after this beautiful Jewish myrtle tree. the Babylonians stole that name from her and named her Esther. Now let me give you the name of a Babylonian goddess of love, Ishtar. Can you hear it? Esther, Ishtar. So how Mordecai's name is attached to the Babylonian god Marduk, they've named Esther after the Babylonian goddess of love, Ishtar. Horrible, horrible. What other name derives, what other word, what other holiday derives from this name, Ishtar? Easter. Babylonian goddess of love is who Easter is named after. One more statement of let me define that in case you're saying, wait a minute, we all celebrate Easter. No, we do not. We celebrate Resurrection Sunday. And you say, well, what's the difference? It's just a word. Yes, but Easter is a word that's taken from the pagan goddess Ishtar. Easter has to do with the woman-child fertility cult. And Easter, that word Easter, is never found in the Bible. Ever. It's Passover. It's Pesach. It's not Easter. You may find Easter in some alterations of the Bible and some translations of it. You'll never find it in a Hebrew or a Greek translation anything close to the Babylonian goddess of love, Ishtar. Passover is what Jesus celebrated. And we celebrate Resurrection Sunday 3 days after His Passover when He was raised from the dead. We do not celebrate Easter because words have meaning, and Satan has infiltrated the greatest holiday that the Christian has and ruined it with this word Easter. So, a myrtle tree. Hadassah means myrtle. It's a beautiful name. The young lady, let's keep going. The young lady, Esther, was beautiful of form and face. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and the decree of the king was heard, that decree that we're going to gather all the beautiful young virgins, and it says here Esther's beautiful, she's got to go. When the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. So you've got this group of beautiful young women, all virgins that have convened in Susa for a 1-year cosmetic treatment so that they can begin spending one night with the king. In verse 9 it says, now the young lady, and we're talking about Esther. Again, listen, they say God's name isn't involved in the book of Esther, that it's never mentioned, etc. But tell me that God's not involved here. The young lady pleased Haggai. Now Haggai again was the person that the king put in charge of taking care of all these women. The young lady pleased Haggai, and she found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food. Gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Now, I tell you, this is a 12-month-long process, so Esther must have enjoyed her status in the harem after Haggai had given her a good hand here. But it's interesting in verse 9 that he quickly provided her with her food. Now, if you remember, I tell you, the Mosaic Law is trampled in this story. It's trampled in this beautiful short story of Esther. Remember what happened in the book of Daniel when they gave Daniel the Babylonian food. Daniel said, I don't want it. I won't eat it. He said, let me have my Jewish food for a few days and see if I'm still healthy. And if I am, may I continue eating that. Daniel stood up when the Babylonians tried to give him their food. Do you see anything here that says Esther refused the food? No, she's living like a Persian. She is totally removed from the Jewish way of life, so much so that nobody even knows she's a Jew. She has hidden her identity as a Jew. Now let me ask another question. Why is Esther beautiful? Does Esther's look have anything to do with this story? What's the answer? Does the fact that Esther's a beautiful woman have anything to do with the fact that she has jumped up in this Haggai's mind and she's getting special treatment? Is there a reason why God made Esther beautiful? Yes is the answer. You wonder why people look the way they do. Why are some look like this, some look like that? Because God has a reason for every single part of our bodies looking the way they do. And this particular woman had to be made beautiful, and she must have been stunning. She must have been stunning. Of all the young virgins that convene in Susa, this man Haggai looks at her and says, she is a cut above. And if God wouldn't have made her beautiful, this story doesn't take place and Israel is dead. Beauty. Of all things, beauty. There's a reason in God's perfect mind and in His perfect plan why Esther was the beauty that she was. But look what it says in verse 10. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. So she was totally concealing her identity as a Jew, a nation of God Jew. Totally concealing her identity. And everybody bought it. She was not living by the Mosaic law at all. Every day, in verse 11, every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Literally, this how she fared means to know the peace, P-E-A-C-E, to know the peace of Esther. He walked back and forth to know the peace of Esther. How's she doing? Is she at peace or not in this harem, knowing what's about to happen to her? The fact that Mordecai was in front of the court means that Mordecai had some sort of official position. We'll see more about that in a minute. In verse 12, now when the turn of each young lady came to go into King Ahasuerus, and what are they doing? They're spending one sexual night with the king, and he's going to choose his favorite. There's no other way to say that. That's what they're doing. When the turn of each young lady came to go into King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months, that's why I say it's a year, there it is, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the woman, or for the women, for the days of their beautification, were completed as follows. 6 months with the oil of myrrh, a very fragrant oil, and another 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. So when her time came after her 12-month treatment sessions, this is what would happen. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Clothing, jewelry, anything that would make this young virgin stand out in the eyes of the king, whatever she wanted to take in that night, she could take in. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem. You say, Rick, why are you so sure that every one of these women went in and had sex with the king? Because when she came out, when she went in the evening and spent all night with him, when she came out in the morning, she didn't return to the harem of the young, beautiful virgins. She's all of a sudden in a different grouping. She's with the concubines now. And the concubines are the non-wives of the king that he has sexual relations with. So when she would return in the morning, she went not to the same harem, but to a second harem, to the custody of a different man, Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge not of the beautiful young virgins, but of the concubines. That night changed every one of them that went into the king. They lost their virginity to the king, one night after another. She would not go in again to the king unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. So most of these girls, however many there were, would never see the king again. They'd go in to the concubine service. They'd be there forever. They'd be whatever a concubine did other than the obvious. And most of them would stay there forever. But don't lose sight of the fact that something changed on that one night with the king. She would go in a virgin and come out a concubine. So and that's exactly what Esther will do. I say that so strongly because a lot of people, at least some Christian Bible teachers that I've heard, go to lengths to protect Esther's character in the story. And I see no need to protect Esther's character in the story. It is what it is. That's all. She's not following the law. She's going to marry a Persian, not a Jew. She's not eating the right food. She's hiding her identity as a Jew to everybody. What is the great tragedy if she goes and spends a night with the king like all these others? She's so far out of keeping the Mosaic law and pleasing the Lord. This is just another sin. I've got no problem with it, especially because the Bible makes it so clear. They go in one thing, in the morning they come out a different thing. It is what it is. When the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in as his daughter, when the turn of Esther came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women, advised. Haggai had taken a special interest in Esther a year ago. She trusted him. She said, "What should I do? What should I wear? What cosmetic? What earrings? Whatever. You tell me, and that's what I'll do." Very interesting. She didn't put on any different airs. She didn't have a plan of her own. She figured Haggai is a man and he knows, so I'll just do what he says. It's very interesting. So she didn't request anything except what he advised her. And then it says Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. If everyone who saw her would have known she was a Jew, she would have not found favor. She had hidden and concealed her identity very, very well. That's not a good thing. But it is what it is. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. And that's how we can so clearly and accurately build a timeline in the book of Esther. It gives us times. Just quickly, when it came Esther's turn to go into the king for the night, I say they're trampling the Mosaic law. In Exodus chapter 20, very clearly, one of the 10 commandments is you shall not commit adultery. That's exactly what Esther's doing here. Trampling the Mosaic law. In verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. Why did God make Esther beautiful? Because whatever Esther was, whatever Esther looked like, she was the perfect woman to King Ahasuerus. Whatever she looked like turned his head and did it quickly. She found favor in the eyes of the king. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. How does a Jewish girl become queen in Persia? God makes you beautiful. You completely disobey everything you know to live as an obedient Jew, and you go in and you spend a night with the king. That's how you do it. The king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. He was very happy that he had found a new queen to replace Vashti, this beautiful woman, Esther. In verse 19 it says, when the virgins, this is another group of virgins, why they were gathered, we don't know, we're not told. But when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. This means that Mordecai is an official in the palace of Persia. He's some sort of official that he would be able to sit at the gate, because it's at the gate where they do business. It's at the gate where the judges hear cases and give verdicts. It's at the city's gate. And Mordecai somehow is part of a royal official. He's got an official capacity, and that's why he can sit at the gate. So Esther had not, it says, Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people. And Israel to all the world was to show the Lord, to show the world that they were God's chosen people, the Jew. To draw people to a relationship with God. And Esther's doing the exact opposite. She's completely concealing her identity as a Jew. She didn't let her kindred or her people be known, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did. She obeyed Mordecai. Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when she was under his care. So again, the Jewish laws of how to dress, what to eat, who to marry, weren't followed at all in the book of Esther. They were ignored. At the worst, they were ignored. At best, they were simply not followed, but at worst, they were forgotten and ignored. The Mosaic law never comes up in this book. She simply wasn't obeying the Mosaic law. That answers the question, how does a Jewish girl get to be the queen of Persia just like that? A few more verses and we'll close. Look at what it says. What we're about to read here is a change in the story. Mordecai is going to save the life of the king. And this is huge. This is a huge part of the story. That Esther is now the queen, and that Mordecai saves the life of the king. These are big events. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, remember I tell you that's where business took place, where disputes were settled, where judgments were ruled out. This is a judicial system. This is where the judicial system worked, in the gate of the city. While Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, more pet names. Two of the king's officials, we don't know anything about these people other than they were snakes and they wanted to kill the king. Two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. They wanted him dead. This is an assassination plot. But cousin Mordecai hears it. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king, and look what it says, in Mordecai's name. So Esther made sure that the king knew Mordecai saved your life today. She told the king of the plot and said it was Mordecai who saved your life. And that will come back in the next few chapters for certain, the fact that Mordecai saved the king's life. The king doesn't do anything for him now, but he'll remember it later and come back to reward Mordecai. But he doesn't do it immediately. All part of God's plan. He knows exactly what's going on. Now when the plot, it says here, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, to be true, that these two men really wanted to kill Mordecai or kill the king, they were both hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. And that's the end of Esther chapter 2. And we'll pick up there next time, but I want to show you this. When we as Americans hear the word gallows, isn't that exactly what you think of? Steps you walk up, that space in the floor there is usually that trapdoor is up. The guy that's going to be hanged goes there, they put the noose around his neck, that trapdoor flings open, he hangs from his neck until dead. That is not what is happening in Esther's day. Look what it says in Ezra 6:1, which is at the same time. In Ezra 6:11, it says, and I issued a decree that any man who violates this edict, a timber shall be drawn from his own house, and he shall be impaled on it. And his house shall be made a refuse heap on account of this. So take a timber, one solid timber from his house, and jam his body on it, impale his body on that timber. That's how they were killing people in Persia. Two depictions. Sorry for the grotesqueness of it. But you see this particular guy right here, hanging from that hook, having been impaled. This is the way they were killing people then. This guy is being lifted up so that this guy can slide his body over and drop it onto that hook. That's one way they impaled people, but maybe that came later. This is a more probable way that these two men were impaled. You see that guy on the right-hand side of the screen on a sharpened pole that was just jammed through his body. That's impaling. And that's what the ancient gallows in Esther's day, that's how they killed people. Now, I showed you that not to be grotesque, but because that impaling has a big part in this story. It comes back again and again. People are impaled in this story. More background. Now Esther's the queen. Mordecai saved the king's life. We can move quickly through the story now. Let's close in prayer.